Bonjour et bienvenue à MTL Connect, la semaine numérique de Montréal. Hello again and welcome to MTL Connect, Montreal's Digital Week. We are kicking off our second segment of the morning. We have a lovely panel on cybersecurity. We're going to talk about solving current challenges in cyber, and I'll introduce the moderator and the guests in just a few seconds. Alors, MTL Connect, nous sommes dans les très beaux bureaux slash locaux de les 7 doigts de la main. On est très contents qu'ils nous ont accueillis ici. J'aimerais rapidement remercier nos partenaires, le gouvernement du Québec et la Ville de Montréal et tous les partenaires sans qui cet événement ne pourrait pas prendre place. Donc, merci beaucoup et merci à vous en présentiel. Bonjour, bonjour. Allô, salut, ça va bien? Bonjour, bonjour madame. Bonjour madame, bonjour, bonjour monsieur, bonjour. Vous êtes ici en présentiel, merci d'être ici avec nous. Et il y a plusieurs activités à découvrir tout au long de la journée. On a des conférences, des panels, des classes de maîtres. On a 2 studios, le studio 2 ici et le studio de danse également. Donc, si jamais vous voulez voir les différents éléments de programmation dans les 2 salles, nous avons aussi le dôme au premier étage, juste en bas de la rentre. On rentre au rez-de-chaussée, juste en bas, il y a le dôme à découvrir à 15h. Il y aura Startup Montréal qui fait une présentation dans le dôme. À midi et à 17h, il y a une troupe de performeurs de cirque, des artistes qui vont faire une prestation de cirque présentée par les 7 doigts de la main, donc à midi et à 17h, aussi au premier étage, juste en bas du rez-de-chaussée. Alors, découvrez toute cette belle programmation, réseautez et profitez pleinement de MTL Connect. Alors, sans plus tarder, without further ado, I'd like to invite the moderator and the guests to come join me. The moderator is Patrick White. Il est professeur de journalisme et responsable du programme baccalauréat en journalisme à l'UQAM. On accueille Patrick et ses invités. Merci Patrick.
Merci, salut.
Bon panel.
Merci. Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning. My name is Patrick White. I'm the head of the journalism program at Université du Québec à Montréal, l'UQAM, French language university here in Montreal. And we're going to talk about cybersecurity for the next 45 minutes with great guests, starting with Bronwyn Boyle. Thank you for the outstanding keynote presentation this morning. You are Chief Security Officer at Mambu. You're from Britain. Yep. And Mambu is a SaaS cloud banking platform, and in the past, you have worked in the UK's open banking implementation entity. Yeah. So thank you for being here.
Merci à vous.
Amir Belkeladi, Partner Risk at Deloitte in Montreal, is joining us as well. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Donc moi, j'ai pas besoin de me présenter, mais bonjour à tous. The reason why I say I don't have to introduce myself is Deloitte is the largest cybersecurity consulting firm out there with about 34,000 people doing cyber. And when Bronwyn was talking about the gap, I'm hiring, just so we're clear. And just to give you a sense, we grow about 30% a year, and with the turnover due to the pressure we have on staff, it's another 30%. So that's 20,000 people a year we need to hire.
Thank you, Amir. Vanessa Henri, the Henri and Wolf avocat, co-fondatrice, co-founder of the firm. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
And Jeremy Clark, who is professor at Concordia University in Information Systems Engineering.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Maybe Bronwyn, starting with you, present yourself, what you do precisely, and talk a little bit about the UK market and what's happening in the cybersecurity field in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm currently Chief Security Officer at Mambu. And again, apologies to repeat for those of you who were here previously, but we're a cloud-based SaaS core banking provider. So we've got customers across the globe ranging from very small microfinance organizations all the way up to internationally recognized tier 1 banks. And it's interesting, so before that I was actually heading up security and counter fraud, as you mentioned, at the open banking implementation entity in the UK. And I was just swapping notes with Amir here on what's happening in the open banking space in Canada. It was a real pleasure and privilege to be part of that journey that's changing the access to finance and changing the way that customers can interact with their financial data. And I think that's a really pivotal point that's continuing to drive the UK market. So right now, it's fair to say open banking is really making its presence felt. For those of you who are less familiar with it, it essentially offers banking customers the empowerment to utilize the banking data that they've gathered over the years with trusted third parties for their own benefit, so to access different types of services or to get better deals and better credit outcomes. It was particularly helpful during the pandemic when a lot of people's cash flow was disrupted. They didn't have access to the same type of steady funds, and therefore they got disqualified from a lot of credit decisioning from more traditional banking and lending. Open banking is a kind of a great way of rebalancing that, because they were able to use their historic data to demonstrate that they would have mechanisms to recover post-pandemic, and it was a real lifeline for many people. So I think it's great to see how that is driving the UK market, and it's great to see it making it overseas.
Vanessa, can you talk to us a little bit about yourself and your law firm in Montreal, specializing in data governance and cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a lawyer, don't throw anything at me. And Henri and Wolf is a law firm that is multidisciplinary. So we have engineers in cybersecurity as well as lawyers, and we provide integrated services that include legal advice, but we also help our client manage their risk with regards to data. We work with a lot of critical infrastructure, a lot of startup, a lot of emerging technologies that have that want to work at the product level. So they really need to improve the security of the product level, but also anticipate the wave of regulatory changes that will affect their technologies in the future, whether it's AI, data governance, cybersecurity for IIoT. So we have an integrated team, and we work with, I'm going to say, amazing clients that have quite innovative projects.
Thank you. Jeremy, Concordia University is a very large English-speaking university in Montreal. You have a team dedicated to cybersecurity at Concordia. So what is it you do precisely at Concordia? And can you tell us a little bit about your cybersecurity team at Concordia University?
Sure. So we have an institute that specializes in security. There's maybe 10 to 15 professors. They look at all different aspects of security. So it could be smart grid control systems, it could be network analysis, forensics, it could be cryptography, authentication. So my subspecialty is I spend 90% of my time now on blockchain technology or cryptocurrencies. And so that's my main research area. And before that, I looked a lot at voting systems. And so in Canada, at the federal level, we still vote on paper, but at the provincial level and other provinces other than Quebec, or at the municipal level, you see electronic voting happening, and so we look a lot at the security of those systems as well.
Thank you very much. Amir, Deloitte. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you guys do about cybersecurity for the world and for Canada as well.
So, I started my intro by saying we have about 30,000 people in cybersecurity at Deloitte advising clients from strategy to running their operations. So today, if you've taken the train, it's probably my team that was watching the cyber attacks against that train and protecting them in Canada. If you took a plane, it's likely that they were involved. If you took your car, the city would have been protected. That's what our people do. And when I say this, it's all the cyber people out there protect us every day. And as Bronwyn was saying in her previous presentation, cyber is going to be everywhere. So we have to draw a lot of people to help us to protect the world around us.
Bronwyn, regulation, law enforcement evolving everywhere, UK, China, Canada. What's on your radar right now as far as regulation is concerned?
Yeah, so interesting discussion just previously around kind of the need to make sure that device manufacturers, software providers are really building cybersecurity in by design and by default. And I think we're seeing, good, I think, international cooperation to try and kind of drive forward a raising of the bar and setting of minimum standards in that. There's been a couple of kind of interesting legislations passed more recently that are probably worth calling out. We talked a little bit, about kind of scams and about that social engineering aspect. And one real challenge in the UK was the fact that a lot of folks were getting lured into fraud or into scams through fake advertising or, kind of Instagram or TikTok messages that were, looking to get money mules or also looking for kind of people to kind of share information. The UK has now passed an Online Safety Act, which is now holding that type of advertising liable for, it's now criminally prosecutable if you're advertising related to fraud, which is a great step forward, right, for trying to kind of reduce the ground zero of where some of these fraudulent activities can start from. I think the other piece as well in China is that they've been looking to put more onus now as well on telco providers. So again, if any one of us gets a smishing text, like an SMS phishing attack, right, that's gone through the telco provider, right? There's massive scale of use across internet and telcos that, again, that's the kind of the top of the chain in terms of getting attacks out. And I think the idea of having legislation that brings some skin in the game for those types of organizations is really important.
Vanessa, what's the situation like for Quebec and Canada in terms of actual and current regulations?
Right, so if you have not learned about Bill 64, you definitely don't have TV, you don't have internet. This is a bill that passed last year about personal data. But I want to talk about other things that are happening in cybersecurity. We have the Bill C-26 at the federal level, where companies would be, because it's not adopted today, but would have to notify the ransomware attack. The logic behind this is the government cannot protect us if they don't know what's happening. So that's I think the bill that is under discuss right now is really Bill 26. We have Bill 27 at the federal level. Not sure this is going to go through. PIPEDA has been notoriously very difficult to amend. But what C-27 would like to do is a data tribunal. One reason for this, if you go through legal precedent, you'll see that judges have particular understanding of the technological context in certain cases, so they would like to have a tribunal that's specialized for this. But one last thing I'd like to say, because I knew this question was coming, I did a little poll on my LinkedIn and I asked, where do you think the next regulations are going? I voted for product liability, but I was surprised of the amount of people, the vast majority voted for responsible disclosure. A lot of people voted for director and officers liability as well. So it will be interesting to see where that goes.
Jeremy, what's on your radar right now as far as regulation is concerned? Regulations, yeah.
Right. So there's no, in the blockchain space anyway, there's no global regulation or national regulation that covers all blockchain. It's just a question of how you use it and then how that intersects with existing regulations. So almost all different enforcement agencies at the federal level or at the Quebec level touch on blockchain in some sense. So just to give a layout, I'll do it off the top of my head. I might miss stuff. But one of the innovations of blockchain is if you have an idea, you can push it, say to Ethereum, if you can code it up, you can push it and in 15 minutes it's live and anyone can put money through it. So there's a super low barrier to entry. So that concerns financial regulators, right? Are you creating financial products? So I do a lot of work, research collaboration with AMF, which is the regulator of financial markets in Quebec. So it's on their radar, and they have processes in place for you to register and work with them to market your products. Taxation's an issue. So CRA has advice. Quebec, the tax agency has advice on how to report things. Auditing's another thing. So I work with Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton. So there's auditing standards. So if you're a publicly traded company, you need to, create an audited financial statement and produce it. It has to be signed off by an auditor. You're holding a bunch of cryptocurrencies. The auditor has to go in and try and understand them and try to value them and make sure that you have custody over them. And so that's another. So for a long time, we didn't see the big four really active. Maybe you'll correct me on trying, jumping into this space and helping out companies that are publicly traded that are sitting on a lot of cryptocurrencies, because there's a lot of risk in doing that. If you get the audit report wrong, then there's bodies that regulatory bodies in Canada that you could run afoul of, and we saw examples of that. Not with big four firms, but with smaller firms. And so anyway, so RCGT is sort of trying to innovate in that space and try and bring in tech people like myself to try and help understand the space. RCMP, law enforcement, FinTrack, financial tracking. There's all your know your customer laws apply to exchanges anywhere where you change Canadian dollars into a cryptocurrency and vice versa. Law enforcement has a pretty good track record of shutting down, like underground markets, like Silk Road was the first one, but there's been a lot since. And yeah, now I'm, and the latest thing is that there's some technologies that allow you to anonymize and obfuscate cryptocurrency. So ransomware companies will use this, not companies, ransomware, people who do ransomware, hackers or whatever. And so in the US, just a month ago, OFAC actually put on their sanction list one of these services, and it was very controversial because it's not a company, it's just a technology. It's something that's sitting on the blockchain, and they say, basically, you cannot interact with this smart contract that's sitting on the blockchain. And so we don't know the full ramifications of what that will mean. It's still like kind of being fleshed out, but that's an interesting thing to watch as well.
Merci, thank you. Amir, what's on your radar right now as far as regulations are concerned and law enforcement? Evolving as well.
I think you had a pretty comprehensive answer there, but if I want to take a step back, to me, law and regulation is kind of the minimum standard that government is trying to push or regulators are trying to push. That's one step. The reality is then after you have to be commercially savvy if you're an organization to achieve your commercial goals. And then again, back to the earlier presentation, we talked about ethics in cybersecurity, super important. You will find out there are lots of studies around how we deal with ethics. So the law is one thing, ethics is very different. As people who use something, I think for me it's more important that it meets my values. So understanding these boundaries is super important. Now, if you take a step back and look at all this, the reality is all those regulations will go to really core principles of cybersecurity around controlling access, knowing who's doing what, etc. We'll build from there, but I think the goal for Quebec anyway, and Canada and other nations is to take a step back and look at this from an ethical standpoint. The reason for this is because you don't want to stop at that low level of minimal criteria of the law. You want to look at this from an ethical standpoint. This is how do you respond to your population for a greater good, more purpose, etc., etc.
Bronwyn, the geopolitical situation is very tense right now with the war in Ukraine. Where do you see this impacting cyber risk to society as a whole?
Yeah, it was very interesting in the run-up to the war. We were all on kind of high alert, I think. Probably everybody on this panel felt a little bit of that trepidation. And I think the expectation was that it would precipitate quite a significant amount of cyber activity, not just directly with the conflict itself, but also bad actors looking to exploit kind of those periods of uncertainty and some of the mechanisms that were kind of behind the conflict. There was a lot of concern, again, around potential retaliations against countries that had deployed sanctions. And so essentially that whole geopolitical landscape really turned up the heat on defensive capabilities across the globe. So we saw the US respond with Operation Shields Up, as they said, so really kind of putting into defensive mode proactive measures to kind of shore up systems and vulnerabilities. It was also interesting to think about the fact that this was coming on the back of Log4j. So I mentioned that in my last presentation, that very significant internet bug in December of last year. I think we're starting to see how these knock-on effects of systemic vulnerabilities, coupled then with real-world geopolitical tensions, can add up to a kind of troubling landscape.
Vanessa, as a law firm, as a lawyer as well, how do you see this impact of geopolitical risk on the cybersecurity field?
I think it's a call for diversity of thought because the risks are geopolitical. So you cannot, for an ethnocentric point of view in Canada, understand that geopolitical risk. You got to work with the team. You're going to think about follow the sun model where you have different perspective on the threats. You're going to think about improving your cyber threat intelligence capabilities. You're going to think also about partnering with people worldwide. We've mentioned it several times. There's a gap in talents. Accessing a worldwide pool of talents is important. So from that perspective, we cannot solve this issue from our office in our home. The other perspective is a little bit more controversial, but I will say it anyway, is that if we are in a cyber war, the line between surveillance and military complex becomes very, very thin in cybersecurity. So you have cybersecurity firms that are on the line of a military complex. And we're going to be careful about this, about who's watching the watcher, right?
Jeremy?
Sure. So I have a lot of colleagues, they work on what they call mesh networks or ad hoc networks. So it's basically if you don't have an internet, and we all have cell phones, could our cell phones sort of relay messages for each other. And this was interesting, but honestly, I found it kind of boring. You know, it was about the applications were, I don't know, smart cities or autonomous vehicles, and seemed kind of futuristic, but not here. Then there was a revolution in Iran, and the government decided we're going to turn off the internet, right? Or we're going to heavily censor the internet. And then I saw, oh my God, this is maybe the most important research question. Like, could we get protesters some sort of network capability so that they can relay messages? And you have technologies like Tor that allow you, if you can have some sort of internet connection, then you can sidestep the censorship. But what if you don't even have that internet connection? And so anyway, so geopolitics comes into security a lot, and I think as security people, we need to be solving problems for the real world.
Amir?
So I think, again, covered very nicely by this panelist, but I think Jeremy's on the point there around censorship-proof technologies and innovation driven by this. If you know, I was thinking about it on the way here. If you look at the world we live in, it's very polarized. You look at all sorts of politics out there that are highly polarized. People are looking at censorship-proof. You'll see innovation in that space using blockchain technology for social networks, for example. So you can't shut them down, for example. This would be something that we could see innovation in that space. Now, at the same time, maybe an observation, I'm sure some researchers out there will do the work, but I would say I noticed over the last year or so, ransomware, since the war in Ukraine started, ransomware attacks, anecdotally kind of lowering, less, which in my twisted mind, I think maybe it's because the resources that were doing ransomware are now diverted at doing other things. So they may be involved in the current situation if they're no longer doing as much ransomware as before. I think it will be very interesting to see when this comes down, if we really see a peak in ransomware. So
yeah, just to jump in on that, that's a really interesting point, Amir. And I think, wasn't there kind of an interesting timing, wasn't there, when they busted Revil, the ransomware gang? And I think some kind of questioning, because Russia previously hadn't shown that much incentive to disrupt some of these criminal gangs. And I think there was a question, were they co-opting some of those folks into a career change? So it's a good observation.
Exactly. So the border between state, nation state, and some of those groups is becoming very, very thin. So it will be interesting to see how this develops over the next few years.
Ron, when you talk in your keynote, Vanessa.
I was going to say, if I can add to this, what's funny is that we have people calling the insurance company saying, it's not me, it's Russia, right? So then the insurance company goes and say, well, that's a force majeure. We can't insure you anymore because that's an act of war. Yeah. So we got to be very careful with that. That claim that everything now is a battlefield, because it can backfire very quickly on a company.
Bronwyn, AI, you mentioned in your keynote speech, could be good, could be bad. AI models for predictive cybersecurity. What's the status in this very important field of AI right now that's evolving so rapidly?
It is, and you know, there's no doubt about it. It is, you know, proving very beneficial, I think, in a lot of fields of cybersecurity, particularly where we now have, you know, very heterogeneous systems, loads of different data points, a very kind of tricky signal-to-noise ratio to crunch through, and that's where applications of AI can be really beneficial. You know, in my day job, we're looking at providing services across multiple cloud providers, and each of those have their own security stacks and their own security controls. There isn't parity across, you know, Azure, Amazon, GCP, so you end up with this huge kind of amount of noise and different logs and sensors, etc. And actually, we're trialing kind of some of the new kind of next-gen solutions out there that are looking more, rather than kind of trying to have heuristic blocking or heuristic detection capabilities. They're looking more to kind of baseline what is normal, what is the normal day-to-day operation of your system, and then flag up if they're seeing and observing deviations from that normal. So it's a great opportunity to kind of look at more kind of protection for zero-day threats, where, you know, you don't necessarily have a known pattern, you just have to find that kind of weird blip in kind of regular normalized data.
And what's the downside? You mentioned poisonous activities this morning as far as learning is concerned, AI learning.
Yeah, and I think it is something that we need to really think about. That idea, that data is a really precious asset and it's a precious commodity and it needs to be protected. That necessarily isn't as well thought through, I think, or as prevalent maybe as it needs to be. I think it is quite difficult, I think, for folks who are developing AI and machine learning to even have access to some of these data sets, right? So we're often seeing publicly available data sets that are being reused for different types of training purpose. And I think, again, this is where we need to worry about, if there has been some level of kind of tampering or kind of compromise of integrity in those data sets, there can be quite broad ramifications.
Vanessa?
I'm going to come back to what I was discussing about who's watching the watcher, because predictive cybersecurity has a lot of promises, including helping to bridge the number of missing jobs to begin with. But in many cases, it is very data hungry. And the line between predictive cybersecurity and employee monitoring is very thin. And there's also a danger, like you think about these data prevention tool. We audited a company, and they're taking all of these logs that have personal data, and they were sending that to China. And by the logs, I was able to guess the trade secret. So you have to be very careful about the cybersecurity tools that you have. And unfortunately, people do not do a good due diligence of their cybersecurity vendor because they assume that they will be cybersecure. But in practice, it's not always the case. And just like any algorithm, they have the potential to have biases, discrimination. What if an employee loses his job because of something that was done on his computer? But then you can't really prove it was done by him unless you got that camera going and you take picture. So there's a lot of companies that will complement predictive cybersecurity with even more employee monitoring. So it's a cautionary tale, because those that are doing it well are doing it very well. But do your privacy impact assessment, do your AI algorithm impact assessment, think about it before you roll this type of thing on your employees. But also consider the different vendors there is, where they send you data, ask questions about how their algorithm was done, how it was trained, and whether your data will be used to train the algorithm as well. And be aware that there are risks with algorithm for security standpoint. So there can be attack on test data, so that your test data will fluctuate, and then one threat will go through, and then that is how a bunch of companies will get hacked, even though they have the predictive tool. So questions are very essential, but the technology itself, I think, we still need to try it, because we have a big issue with the number of people that can help.
Jeremy?
Yeah, so everyone seems a little skeptical of AI and machine learning, and I'm from that camp as well. I think it's very good at a narrow set of tasks. There's a lot of snake oil in the industry that's trying to apply machine learning to all sorts of tasks that it should not be applied to. I guess if I want to distill the issue down to like something like a 30-second kind of clip, you can think about, it sort of actually draws on what others have said. What's the consequence for a false positive? Right? So is it someone loses their job, or you lose 30 cents or something, right? And so when you're applying AI, you have to think about, what if there is a false positive, how serious is that? And then you have to think about, how do you even know it's a false positive? So what's the ground truth, right? What's the data that you're using where you know for a fact that this is a false positive as opposed to not? And then you can say similar things about false negatives as well. So the error rate is still there. There's still some non-negligible error rate, even for the applications that it's best at. And so you have to think through the consequences of how are you going to identify those errors, and how important, what's the consequences basically? And are they like way overblown compared to the technology?
Amir?
So I think this is the challenge of the digital world we're moving to. 15 years ago, when I was in the UK, I worked for the largest bank there, and we were doing a merger between two banks, so you can check them out on LinkedIn. And the total amount of data we had between the two largest banks in the UK was 12 petabytes. It's a lot, just so we're clear. 12 petabytes of data we had to merge. Last week, I was with a startup in Canada. They have one product, and they were telling me their product is generating 1 petabyte every 8 hours. Think, a bank, the largest 15 years ago, 12 petabytes, this is 1 petabyte every 8 hours. And the reality of this asymmetric war we're entering into is, first, everyone is generating those ideas in digital ideas, creating data, and no one has a clue how valuable is that little piece of data at the point of creation. This is what Bronwyn was talking about. That poisoning could happen now, but really hurt us in 10 years. when we need to do all those calculations for AI. So what Jeremy was talking about is, as we use it, all the ethical issues, but the reality is today we're generating data, and I tell you what, those 12 petabytes are not protected because they're not super valuable today. They will be in 10 years' time. So the challenge for us asymmetrically is how do we bring the skills to protect all this at the point of creation? That's a super hard challenge that you raised this morning.
A really interesting point as well, Amir, and again, I'm sure you've heard this, the kind of hack now, crack later that's happening. So there's obviously with the advent of quantum crypto and the ability for quantum computing potentially to break current encryption algorithms, we're hearing about kind of land grabs where hackers are actually taking encrypted data and the knowledge that, okay, we can't crack this data right now, we can't decrypt it, but the technology is developing all the time and we might be able to get into this in the next year or two. So your point around that downstream value is really valid.
If I can jump into,
Sure.
the example I always give is, Lance Armstrong, everyone knows, the cyclist who was caught doping. When he was caught, there was tests that were done at a certain period of time, but the urine samples were from like 10 years previous, right? So they were always saying one step ahead of the tests, but you can't control that time gap, right? And so all the data from a privacy perspective, all the data that you're releasing, to the internet, to data holders, the algorithms right now might not be creepy. They might not do things that creep you out, but that data is still going to be around in 10 years. It's going to be around in 20 years when the algorithms are going to be a lot better, right? And it's too late. You can't, maybe there's laws and regulations, right, to forget and things like that, but essentially your data is gone and, it's going to be exposed to algorithms in 20 years.
Bronwyn, the financial services industry response overall, how would you rate it right now?
I think the financial services industry has always been a little bit ahead of the curve because, it experiences pain, right? So it experiences bottom line dollar losses, and it's had to, I think, respond quite quickly to changing cyber threats. I think, as an industry, it's great to see how some of the best practices and some of the use cases that have I take certainly for granted in my day job because, I've been living and breathing FS for 20 odd years. You actually kind of take a step into other industries and you realize, hey, you know what, there's a lot of opportunity here to share some of these best practices, share these controls, and be a bit more collaborative for other industries maybe who mightn't have felt the pain financially right now, but again, to Jeremy's point, could very much be at the forefront of that downstream data compromise. So I'm a big believer and an advocate in collaboration and kind of knowledge sharing.
Vanessa, it seems that Canada is a bit far behind OECD countries about investing in cyber security, so far behind Israel and the US as well. What's going on in Canada? Where's the leadership in Canada about cybersecurity?
What I see we're far behind, I guess we took a different approach to data, which was maybe more European-centric, where we maybe are far ahead in terms of data privacy, whereas the US has always taken a data security standpoint, right? So that also explains why you have like the National Institute of Standard and Technology that have so many standards and their critical infrastructure. Although we've seen it doesn't always work, they do have regulation and they do have standards to follow. I think we're lagging behind in terms of protecting our critical infrastructure, and we saw that during the pandemic because what is critical infrastructure has grown significantly. So you had some app on the market, all they wanted to do is deliver a coffee to you, and they became essential to people to survive, and they were not built like that. They were not built with security by default. And we've seen that with, let's say, the uses of QR code. It's all over. You don't know if you're scanning a ransomware or not, but people are just scanning everywhere now because it's the new thing, right? So I think we lag behind in terms of setting standard, in terms of auditing our own critical infrastructure and protecting our hospital, our children at school. I'm the parent that goes to the parent assembly and raise their hand and say, but what software do we use? Do they have a privacy policy? And people just look at me like, those kids are getting shot at school. We don't care about that. Right? But I'm like, but I care because it's going to be there in 20 years. And there are regulations on data retention, but nobody's following them. And we are lacking, and we're lacking into the funding for supporting our regulators. Because it's one thing to say we pass a law, it's another thing to enforce it. It costs a lot of money to find people that are qualified to do this type of audit, to sue this company in court, and then we got to pay these judges. So all of this means that I think we're lacking in enforcement. And if you call the Canadian Cybersecurity Center very often, you'll get to know everybody very quickly.
Jeremy, what about funding for cybersecurity research at the university level across Canada? You mentioned to me earlier that it's very strong, money is flowing everywhere in the US. What's the situation like in Canada right now, in Quebec maybe a little bit?
Right. So yeah, I'd say that we don't have a lot of problem getting funding for security research. We have a big commitment from NSERC, they're kind of the federal level agency that gives out a lot of money. There's other organizations, if I start listing them, I'm going to forget one, and then I'll be in trouble. But we also see it from the federal government as well. So we recently secured a large grant somewhere in the territory of 80 million. It's being shared by like over 100, maybe 200 security researchers across Canada. But yeah, there's been a large commitment. We see it in the US, maybe even stronger in the US. There's a lot of investment happening at the academic level in cybersecurity, so I have no complaints about that.
Amir, what about yourself here in Montreal and across the globe as well?
So I think actually it's not too late, and I think it's not when you started, because everyone is behind in terms of when they started. I think in Canada we have this unique opportunity in two ways. One is we have a very strong ecosystem, so the funding that Jeremy just mentioned is done in collaboration with the private sector. So in total it's 160 million, so private sector is putting as much as the federal in there, and many of the Quebec-based organizations are contributing to that, including ourselves. So that's one. The ecosystem is the best way to protect ourselves, because it's not a single entity that can do this. So that's one. Second thing, where Canada is very different, is in our diversity. We talked about it. I have people in my team. I have just hired a modern dancer in my group, and she is part of the largest and best cybersecurity organization out there. That woman, we're going to train her, and she's going to bring a unique perspective. Think about the session we had. Bronwyn was unique and inspirational to me many years ago with her PhD in philosophy, and I thought, if you bring that kind of brain to my problems that are usually tackled with engineers, you bring the two together and it gives you an amazing answer, innovative, where we can skip problems. And that's where Canada is stronger. We have the most diverse population out there in the big world, compared to the global organizations that I see. And these two things, ecosystem and diversity, will make us number one.
Thank you.
I would like to just do a mention of honor to our Ministry of Cybersecurity that was created last year. I think it's worth mentioning. It's not everywhere. It's not in other provinces. They have done tremendous work to bring 310, I think, different governmental entities in line. When there was a LogG event, they managed to go offline in 30 minutes, 300 different entities. I've worked with a group of companies, that doesn't happen. It's the question of days usually. So big step forward. I'm not saying that it's going to solve everything. I'm not saying that the government is going to solve the private businesses either. But it is great that it has been recognized and we have a ministry, because it gives us hope also to have more standard for critical infrastructure.
We have 6 minutes left. Do we have questions from the public? We have 2 microphones for you here and there. Please feel free to ask questions to our 4 guests. You have questions? You're more than welcome to ask them right now. Okay, well, critical infrastructure. Question? Question, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Maxime Gounet. I'm a student in networking and cybersecurity. My first question is that, do you think today we can talk about again private life in today's digital world? This is my first question. Did you get the question? Do you think today we can talk about private life in today's digital world? I have 3 questions. That's my first question. The second question is that, do you think that cybersecurity is the cybersecurity ecosystem is really regulated? Then my question will be to I forgot the name.
Vanessa.
Yes, sorry. My third question is to the Deloitte.
Call me Deloitte. Call me Deloitte.
what do you think about the resources that companies put into to cyber security today, the cyber security teams? Do you think companies invest in the cyber security teams? I have a last question, sorry. That's the fourth question.
Thank you for your questions.
Okay.
So I'll start with that one so people will remember the questions. So the question was about the level of investment that the companies are putting in cybersecurity. Is that enough? The reality is, clearly we can do more. It's very hard to gauge how much you're investing. What I could tell you is, for 100% of our clients, cybersecurity is in the top 5 risks they're seeing, and therefore, at the board level, and therefore, the investment goes accordingly. When the boards realizes the level of risk, then they put investments in guidance with that, given their business circumstances. So it is, even today, even with the crisis or any potential headwinds coming from an economic standpoint, cyber remains there as one of the biggest priorities for our clients. And we cover most of Canada. So from a Canadian standpoint, they invest a lot in this space.
Bronwyn for the UK, maybe?
Yeah, I would echo Amir's sentiments. You know, I think because of the widespread damage that organizations can now suffer from cyber attacks, it has very firmly put that board level visibility and it drives board level investment. A challenge is always to make sure that you're using the right metrics and you're using the right data points to be able to help the board make sure that they're allocating the right level of investment. And I like to really try and look into this as kind of cybersecurity as an enabler. How can you use cybersecurity to accelerate your route to market? How can you leverage it more as a kind of a positive rather than just a kind of a back office drain of budget?
Jeremy?
Well, in terms of academia is different than companies, but certainly, like I indicated, there is a lot of attention to it. If you flip it around from the student's perspective, there's a lot of demand for education and security. Our students don't seem to have a lot of trouble getting jobs when they come out of our programs. So there's a demand in industry for talent as well. And so, so it's a good field.
Vanessa?
You know what I'll do? I'll grab your second question on the regulations, so you have a 2-for-1. Are we regulated enough or too much? In my point of view, the regulations that are going forward now is we take the principle of law that has existed since forever, and now we specify it because people don't get it. That's what's happening. Directors and officer liability is one of the oldest principles of law. As a director, you got to protect the corporate asset. Everybody knows that. We don't need a regulation on directors and cybersecurity. The reason why we're doing it is that now we're creating very clear lawsuit, and we're creating presumptions, and then we're doing that for awareness. But where I think that there's actually a lack of, or there's an issue with the regulation is around responsible disclosure and the protection of the researchers in cybersecurity. If you cannot reverse engineer something, then you cannot see if it's secured. So there's somebody in New Brunswick that reverse engineered his parents' doorbell, and it took him about 10 minutes to get in the house, notified the company sued him because it says you breached the terms and conditions, you did reverse engineering on my proprietary technology. So the Canadian Centre of Cybersecurity had to jump in. So there's no real protection, but there is a criminal offense of going into a third party in an unauthorized manner. Now, that doesn't mean to remove that, because that is obviously useful, but there's going to be some way for the researcher to feel confident that what they're researching, they're not going to get sued for that.
Well, that's all the time we have for this morning. There's 25 seconds left. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Bronwyn, thank you for flying to Canada and being with us today and this week.
Delighted.
And Amir, merci beaucoup. Thank you. Merci tout le monde.
Merci.
The next talk is going to be at 3 p.m. on the second floor. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, merci.
Testing. Allô. Alors, merci beaucoup à Patrick d'avoir modéré ce beau panel et merci aussi aux invités Jeremy Clark, Vanessa, Henri, Amir Belkaladi et Bronwyn Boyle. On les applaudit encore une fois. Merci. Alors, nous allons reprendre avec une autre conférence sur le cyber d'environ une dizaine de minutes. Alors, petite pause café, n'allez pas trop loin. On a un autre conférencier très intéressant à vous présenter. Alors, petite pause et on se retrouve dans quelques instants. Merci.